Today we have a fantastic presentation lined up for you guys. Advanced Fiddler Techniques, presented by, and you know, I apologize, Robert.
Boedigheimer.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
He works for Schwan's Home Delivery, providing business solutions with web technologies. He is a Microsoft MVP, a Progress developer expert for Fiddler, an ASPInsider, a Pluralsight author, and a third-degree black belt in Tae Kwon Do. Very impressive. Slightly scared.
Well, it's virtual, right? You're safe.
You know, we're very close distance here. You're like about 5 inches from me. So Robert regularly speaks at national and international events, and today he's graced us with his presence here in our small group. Thank you very much, Robert.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. All right, well, we'll get started. We're going to talk about advanced Fiddler techniques. And we went through most of this, so I won't go through that again. I'll just point out that I do have my Twitter, my email, and blog information. And I do have the slides, and I have a little bit of code for what I'm pulling up for some of the demos. And so that will all be available, and there'll be a link at the very end where you can get that. Feel free as we go to put questions in the chat, or if they're too complicated, unmute and ask it there. Either way, we'll just take questions as we go. So the first thing we're going to talk about is HTTP. So HTTP is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and that's what we're going to see throughout the talk tonight. So it's the communication protocol used between the web clients and the web servers. And so I gave you 2 links here. The first is to the HTTP 1.1 spec, and the second one is HTTP 2. So I've actually had to read these before. So it is useful at times when you're troubleshooting and you're not sure why is something behaving this way, should it behave this way. It helps to refer to these specs. I put the HTTP 2 in italics, so that has been out since about 2015. I just wanted to warn people that Fiddler does not support HTTP 2. So just if you're aware as you're doing troubleshooting, if you were to open up Fiddler and you're trying to see HTTP 2 traffic, you won't be able to see it. It will then downgrade and use HTTP 1.1. HTTP is a request and a response paradigm, and each request and response is going to be made up of both a header and a body, which we'll see throughout the talk. But I just wanted you to see that's the protocol. That's what is going to go back and forth on the wire, and that's what we're going to use Fiddler to be able to inspect. So what is Fiddler? So Fiddler is a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP. So I've been doing web for a really long time. And when I first started and I needed to troubleshoot stuff, it was pretty much Microsoft Network Monitor for me at that time. And Network Monitor was similar to Wireshark is today, where it's basically sitting monitoring your Wi-Fi or your Ethernet card, and it's capturing all traffic. So every protocol that goes across gets intercepted by those. This was specifically built for HTTP. So it was made by Eric Lawrence. So he was working at Microsoft on the clip art team. People would order clip art. They would call his support people and say, I paid for this, I can't download this clip art. And there really wasn't a great tool for people to be able to focus on specifically what was wrong with the HTTP. So Eric didn't know HTTP, he didn't know C#, he didn't know .NET. He decided to learn all those things and write Fiddler on the weekends, basically, which I always think is amazing when people do that. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012, which is now owned by Progress. And I gave you a link here to where you can get Fiddler. And so there's 2 versions now, which is pretty exciting. So I'm going to focus on Fiddler Classic. So that is the default one that if you've used Fiddler, that's probably the one you've used in the past. And that's only for Windows. Today, that has the most features. And so when I talk about advanced techniques, I'm going to show it to you in Fiddler Classic. Fiddler Everywhere has been out for a while. So this is a cross-platform offering, and they've also redesigned the whole user interface. So the idea is they're slowly building into Fiddler Everywhere all the features that are in Fiddler Classic. So the idea is to get all of that moved over to Fiddler Everywhere at some point. And again, the wins are it's a redesigned user interface and it's cross-platform. So I'll show you later how you could use Fiddler Classic to track things from a Mac or a Linux machine or phones or tablets. But Fiddler Everywhere is the first time you have a reliable version of Fiddler that will run on a Mac or on Linux. So how does it work? I talked about Wireshark. So Wireshark is sitting basically monitoring everything going out my Wi-Fi or my Ethernet. Fiddler doesn't work that way. It's actually what's called a proxy. So it's going to, when I start up Fiddler, it's going to adjust my system proxy configuration to intercept traffic. So I'm just going to pull up the browser here and I'll show you what it looks like by default. So if I go into settings, obviously I'm at home, so I don't have any proxies set up by default. But I'm running the New Edge. I like the New Edge browser. Got a lot of nice privacy features. If I go into the proxy settings and I scroll down, you'll see that currently by default, I don't have any proxy set. So nothing is turned on here. As soon as I start up Fiddler, so again, this is Fiddler Classic. As soon as I open that up, it's going to configure Windows to tell it that it is running on a certain port. So now if I go back into my proxy settings, you can see that there's now a proxy set. If you've ever heard the joke, there's no place like 127.0.0.1. That's home, right? That's the IP address of my own machine. So what Fiddler does is it starts up on port 8888 on this machine. And if I were to go over further to the right here, you could see it's running HTTPS or HTTP. So it's basically telling my browser that if you have HTTP or HTTPS traffic, I want you to route it through that IP address and that port. And that's what makes that gets traced. So why that matters, a lot of people will do tracing, and we'll talk later about some of the things you could use it for. I'm just going to show you, we'll go out to progress here. And you can see I've got some requests being made, and these are all HTTPS, so we'll talk about that in a bit, these tunnels. But effectively now, because Fiddler told Windows it's running on that port, modern browsers automatically pick that up and they use that configuration as you saw. So now everything I'm doing in the browser is actually being routed through Fiddler. So if it turns out that you're using some sort of client and it's not being traced, you need to look into how do you set proxy settings for that client. And I'll talk a little bit later about reverse proxy and some other options, but all the modern browsers just pick that up and automatically start doing that tracing for you. So that's how Fiddler actually works. So I'll talk about web sessions. So I'm an ASP.NET developer. When I think of web sessions, I think of a series of requests. That's just how ASP.NET was. That's their terminology. Eric chose web session to mean a single request and response. And I only mention that because if you're going to read, I've got a reference to his book later, or you look at the documentation. When they talk about a session, they're talking about one single request and response. So I'm going to go look. I've got a fictitious travel web page here. I'm not a designer by any means, but I use Bootstrap and just created this travel page. And if I were to go back in here now, I can see this particular traffic. So if you've seen it, I like to use this and show people, especially people who aren't developers. Typical web pages today are about 75 requests and somewhere between 2 and 3 meg. A lot of people that aren't familiar with the web and how it works assumes your browser asks for one thing and displays it all. And you can see even for this simple page, I've got 12 or 13 requests here for CSS, JavaScript, JPEGs, etc. So I want to show you some of the things that you can do on an individual session. So if I were to look at this bootstrap.min.css, I can simply right click and there's a lot of options of things I can do here. So if it turns out I wanted to save this off, I can just say save response body, and I could save that actual file. So if there's times where you're inside your company, you have a certain website that has a JavaScript file, CSS, maybe a logo that you want to be able to save, you can actually just right click and say save that. I can also click and say mark. So I'm going to mark this in orange. So I work a lot with operations and security people and even third-party vendors. So it's not uncommon for me when I'm doing something on the web and I see something that's wrong or another developer, I'm going to actually do a Fiddler trace and send it to people. So I may want to be able to mark and say this is the request that I'm talking about. I can actually add a comment. So maybe I'd say this is the wrong version. So it's just some simple things I can do so that it's obvious to them which particular request I'm referring to. And there's a lot of other things in here. Talked about the saving, the marking. I can also come in here and do a filter now. So if I only wanted to see, say, all of the CSS files, I can hide particular things just to make my view easier. They'll still go through Fiddler, but Fiddler won't show them to me in my display. Some of the other things I can do on the web session, so I can search, and this one took me a while, so I want to show it to you. If I look at my request here, I'll see there's this Halflings font. So it's not uncommon, especially we have multiple web developers. We have third parties that might have particular content I have to host. So I might see that font file and think, I don't really know why we're requesting this file. I want to know who made that request. So one thing I can do is come and say edit find, and I can type in Halflings and do a search. I must have misspelled it there. I did it again. Should increase my font in here apparently. So there we go. So it found the match. So the actual URL for the font that I saw, it matched on that name, but it still didn't tell me who actually caused that request. So something that took me quite a while to find, there's actually this decode compressed content. So I do a lot of web performance work. All of my content uses HTTP compression, gzip, deflate, etc. Makes a huge difference for text files and such. But one of the problems with the search is that it does not look into compressed content. So I want to make sure I check that. And if I find again, you'll see now it's indicated that bootstrap.min.css is what actually pulled that font in. So at least I knew. Like I said, I'm not a designer. I decided to use Bootstrap. I included that CSS file, maybe not understanding that I would also be using fonts and other things that were going to get pulled in. So it's just nice to be able to trace back and see who actually caused that request. Another way to find that, I can just right click and say select parent request. And that will show me that that came from Bootstrap. So again, because Fiddler is a proxy, it's intercepting all this traffic between the browser and the server. So it's able to determine that information, like who made that request, who initiated the call for that font. So that's very helpful.
Hey, Robert, quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Find parent. Was there an option to decode the content as well, or is that automatically?
There is. So if I come over to the inspectors over here, and I look at the Bootstrap min, and I look at the, so in this case, this wasn't compressed. If we're talking about in this case, so once I did that decode compressed, it decompressed it. So let me do, let's make that request again. So by default, if I come in here, you see it's about 27K. And if I go over to the right in the inspectors, you'll see this. I don't know how well it shows up there as kind of a yellowish bar.
Decode, yeah.
This is compressed. I can either click here to decode it or just change it to none. So I'm going to say decode it. And now you can see it went from 27-ish K to about 122K.
Oh, wow.
And now if I look at the raw, this would be the non-compressed. Had I looked at it before, it would be compressed and binary, if that makes sense.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Another cool thing, you can do Alt. So if I'm in here and I want to see all the other JPEGs, so maybe I click on this JPEG, I can hold the Alt key. If I click on the value of any column, it's going to find all of the other sessions in here that have that same value. So if I hold Alt and click on image JPEG, you'll see it highlights all of the other JPEG files. Or for instance, if I hold Alt, it will show me all of the CSS files. Hold on here, I'm getting, I don't know what it's doing right now. That's odd. Okay, so if I hold the Alt there, it should, yep, it highlights the other ones that have that same value. So it's just a quick way for me to see on any given value. So for instance, if I had a 404 error, I could hold there and see all of the 404s would all be highlighted for me. So that's kind of handy. So that's some of the basic things I can do with the web sessions. Next thing we'll talk about is decrypting HTTPS. So if you're not using HTTPS for your entire website, you should. Years ago, like I said, I've been doing web forever. We only encrypted the login portion and the credit card portion. Over the years, there've been a lot of malware and other problems. You really need to use HTTPS everywhere. I've got a whole talk on why you should to convince you if you don't think you need to, but you should use HTTPS. Don't use SSL anymore. People still say SSL all the time when they really shouldn't. The right is TLS, transport level security. Right now you should be using 1.2, or I just turned on 1.3 about a week ago, and our homepage got about 18% faster, which is cool. Less round trips and such. But the point with this is, if you think about what HTTPS is supposed to do, it's supposed to encrypt things between your browser and your server so that people that sit in between can't see things. So it seems very odd that I'm telling you should use HTTPS so people can't see stuff, but you can use Fiddler to see stuff, right? So I'm going to show you why that works in this case, kind of the mechanism of how that functions. So Fiddler becomes kind of a person in the middle in this case, and I'm going to show you how to enable that. So let me go and clear this. Let's go back. I hosted this same page in Azure where I've got HTTPS. So I'm going to make that request. And what you can see in here, I've got connects turned on. So you can see it tunneled and made a request out to my Azure website, but it says it's encrypted. And so it tells me here that it's not able to show me anything like I could see before, and that's what we want, right? We want HTTPS to make it so that people that sit in between, especially evil parties on the internet, can't see or manipulate my traffic. So I'm going to show you how you can do that in Fiddler and why that works. So if you go under Tools Options and go to HTTPS, I'm going to say decrypt traffic. Before I do that, what I want to explain again is Fiddler is a proxy, right? It's sitting between my browser and the server. And I'm intentionally routing that traffic from my browser to Fiddler, which is running on my own machine. So what I can do is if I say decrypt, I'm going to see a series of warnings here. So the way Fiddler does this is kind of cool. It says, if you know how HTTPS works, it uses certificates. So Fiddler is saying it's going to be a certificate authority for me. So it's asking me, will I trust Fiddler to generate certificates? So any certificate that Fiddler would generate, am I willing to trust it? So I'm going to say, yes, I will. It's going to come up with a whole nother warning again and say, do you really want to do this? Yes, I do. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I do. So now what it's done, if I go into you can go into the certificate manager on your machine. And if you go into the certificates, I now have this certificate, and you can see it says, do not trust Fiddler root. So now what Fiddler has done is it says, every time I try to go to a site that uses HTTPS, Fiddler is going to make a fake certificate for it on the fly, sign it, give it to the browser. The browser is going to be okay with that because I just told it I trust certificates that this particular Fiddler just created on my own machine. I'm trusting Fiddler on my own machine to do this. So if I hit OK, I'm going to go request this again. Sometimes I have to restart, so we'll see. Looks like I'm able to see everything okay, right? I can see the bootstrap, the CSS. Here's my images. Here's my JavaScript. So again, I've just been able to see that traffic. So Fiddler went and made, if I go back in here again, Fiddler created a certificate that looks like it's my website right here. So my certificate happens, so I'm hosted on Azure Websites, which is a wildcard. So Fiddler said, I'm going to act like I'm Azure Websites, right? If you understand how HTTPS works, you have certificate authorities that are proving the site is who they say they are, and they sign it. Fiddler has signed this certificate, and because I trust this root certificate, my browser says that's okay. So once I get to Fiddler, Fiddler decrypts it all so that I can see it. And then when Fiddler goes out to the actual website to Azure, it gets the real website certificate, it re-encrypts on the wire. So it's fully encrypted from the browser to Fiddler. It's using Fiddler's fake certificate. From Fiddler going out to the internet to get the actual content, it's using the real web server certificate. So it's all encrypted. Nothing's going to be exposed over the internet while I do this, but I'm able to get in between and see these files. Okay. So again, I want to be able to do that. Years ago, this wasn't a feature. And so I could troubleshoot my whole website. As soon as I went in to sign in, it was dark. I couldn't see anything, so I couldn't troubleshoot anymore. So it's very cool that Fiddler has the ability to do this. And again, I'm not exposing myself to any risk because this is my own machine. I'm trusting Fiddler to impersonate these other sites solely so I can do that decryption. Okay. Next, we'll talk about filters. So the idea with filters, I talked about them briefly when I said you could right click. There's actually a tab in Fiddler where I can do this. So let's go back in here and we'll go to the filters tab. So if I say use filters, there's a lot of different things that I can turn on here. And so I could say I want to only see intranet hosts or internet hosts. I could type in a particular host and say I only want to see traffic to my Azure domain, possibly. I can also say I only want to see traffic from a particular client. So these are all processes that are running on my laptop that I could narrow it down and say, you know, if you've ever turned on Fiddler and you see all of this background chatter from other clients you don't want to see, you could come in here and actually limit it to only be from a particular process. The other thing that's kind of cool is we talked about, so if I filter some of these things, they just don't show up on the sessions list. You can actually make modifications as well. So we talked about the compression earlier. So if I go back and show you the inspector, the way compression works is that the browsers send and say they can handle encoding. So they say accept encoding. So my browser said, I know how to do gzip, I know how to do deflate, I know how to do Brotli. That's what told my web server, go ahead and do compression. And it turns out this case it used gzip on my particular web server. I can actually go in and turn on a filter and I can say, I want to delete that header. So when this gets sent from the browser, because Fiddler sits in between the browser and the server, it doesn't have to just passively watch traffic. It can actually modify things. So now I'm telling it, maybe I want to test out what happens if a certain client comes to my machine and it doesn't handle compression. I just want to see, does everything work okay? So if I turn that thing on, let me go run this again so you can see, you know, Bootstrap here again. If I were to go make that request and come back in and look at it again, you'll see here it's not compressed. So it's up to about 160K just because the browser told it to do compression, but I turned this filter on and said, please delete that header on the fly so that the server doesn't see it. So the server thinks the browser can't handle compression, so it doesn't send it back compressed. So that's kind of cool. We're going to talk about breakpoints later, so I'll skip that. We'll talk about that with some of the debugging. I can hide certain things. So if I use authentication and you're on an intranet with Windows, you'll typically see a first request does a request, it gets a 401 rejection. There's kind of a handshake. If I don't want to see that stuff, I could just turn those authentication requests. You're able to hide some things that maybe you don't want to see. You can also filter by content types. So for instance, if I only wanted to see images, so I'm going to turn that to only do images. I'll go back and I'm going to go do this on my local machine just so it's a little faster. I'm going to hit Control F5. You can see now it's only showing the JPEGs. So if you want to focus on particular things, filters makes it easy for you to see how things are going to behave. Another modification I can do, I can say I want to block CSS files. So if I did that and I came back and hit Control F5, looks kind of what you'd expect, right? Why would you want to do this? One of the performance techniques people are using lately is called Inlining Css. So the idea would be Every time the browser has to request the HTML, it needs to wait for the response. And then the browser will send and say, oh, I need the CSS too, and then wait for the CSS. If I want to improve that performance, I could put just the CSS that paints the main part of the viewport. I could take that CSS and inline it directly into the HTML. And if I did that, then I could see something right away. So the perceived performance right away, you see something while it's waiting to get the rest of the CSS. So what's cool is I can see how good a job I did by turning this on, right? It's a good way for me to test and simulate. If I block the rest of the CSS, I'm only going to use what's inlined. So I could keep tweaking and making sure that it doesn't look like this, right? I want it to look decent and make sure that I inline the right amount of stuff, if that makes sense. So that is that. If you happen to worry about GDPR or CCPA, or you need to warn people that you're setting cookies, you can actually flag responses that set cookies, especially if you're using third-party libraries. You may want to turn that on. If I were to go hit, I don't think I set any cookies on mine. Any of the requests here that set a cookie would be in italics. So it'd be very clear to me that a particular response is setting a cookie. So I'd know that's a vendor or someone I need to worry about from a privacy or warning standpoint, if that makes sense. I can save and load filters if I want. So if I have a set of filters I use all the time, I can actually go in and choose to save them off so that I could import them later. So I can just save them and load them. So if I have particular filter sets I want to use at different times. And then lastly, Eric used to get a lot of requests. One of the main things he'd get for support is people would call and say, I don't see traffic anymore, and they can't remember why. And it turns out that they set up a filter and forgot they had it turned on. So if I turn on this troubleshoot, what it will do is it will warn me every time I'm making requests. If the request was blocked because of filtering, it will actually put a strike through so that I can see it's there. It got a strike through because I have it filtered. So it's just an easy way for me to troubleshoot that something's wrong. So that is filters. Again, it's just, there's other ways to do these things I'm going to show you. It's just a nice graphical way to do some simple things that you might want to do. Next one we'll look at is Composer. So Composer is really what got Fiddler its name. Composer's intention is you can fiddle with requests. So it's interesting to use browser dev tools or Wireshark sometimes to be able to see just the traffic that goes back and forth. One of the real powers of Fiddler is the ability to modify requests. So I want to be able to actually tweak things going between the browser and server that are sometimes hard to do without using a tool like Fiddler. So first I'll show you. I'm going to make a request again for my main page. I'm going to hit Control F5 again in case it's cached. So what I can do is I can go to the Composer. I can drag the HTML request over. And what Composer is going to let me do is it's going to let me basically change the entire request. So I'm going to show the same thing I showed before. I'm going to manually take off the accept encoding, and then I can hit execute. And it now sent to the server. Let me turn off my. It's sent to the server, and now it's not compressed. So before it was about 3K, and now you can see it's about 10K. So again, the idea with that is just I'm able to use Composer and make a modification on the fly. So where would I do this? I've got a site where I can order things, right? So let me go clear this again. I'm going to order one of these convertible tablets. So I'm going to do a checkout, and it says I bought one. They were $1,095. If I go into here, I can see the actual post. So if I look at the inspectors, so if I'm troubleshooting this, I could look at this and say, okay, here's the actual post. And something I'd notice is I see the price is being sent. So the price is actually a post in the actual request. So if I were a hacker, I might look at this and say, well, that's kind of odd, right? I wonder if I can give myself a little discount, right? So I'm going to go back to Composer. I'm going to drag that request over, and I can see here's the cost. I'm just going to change that to $1, right? This is one of those simulations that if the server-side code is correct, it should not be using this cost, right? There's no way you should be taking the price from a client browser where people could make any kind of changes they want. This might be hard for me to test if I didn't have Fiddler. In other words, how do I make the web front end as it's working? How could I get in between there and change that price? So now that I've changed that to $1, I'm going to hit execute. I'll see the request was sent. And if I go into the inspectors, again, that's compressed. So I'm going to take that off. I'm just going to view this in Notepad so it'll be a little easier to see. And if I roll down, it said the order is going to be on your card and it's $1 each, right? Oops, right? The programmer on the server, whoever wrote this, is not checking the price properly. They're basically taking the price from the client, which is a very bad thing. So again, Composer is extremely powerful just because I can sit between the browser and the server and I can modify anything I want. Literally, I can come and type if I wanted to. I can craft an entire request here. I find it a lot faster to make the normal request, drag it over and just modify it, but I can actually make a completely new request, posts, gets, whatever I want to do just to see how the server is going to behave. Another cool thing, you can execute curl commands. So I work with a lot of security firms. They'll make sure that we're doing everything properly. If they find something, they often send and say, here's a curl request that will show you a particular error you're having. It was hard for me to find a trustworthy Windows client that did curl. And so it turns out I stumbled across in Scratchpad here in Composer. It actually lets you run curl commands. So I'm just going to do a curl for bing.com. And if I execute that, I can see the request was made. And if I look at the inspector, you can see that the user agent is curl Fiddler and it made a request for Bing. Okay, so that's kind of cool if you need to do that. Another thing is breakpoints. So again, the cool thing about Fiddler being a proxy, it's sitting between the client and the server. So I can tweak with things and determine what's going wrong without having to change stuff on the server. So I'm going to type down here, there's a quick exec. I'm going to talk about this more later. I'm going to type BPU bootstrap.min.css. So what that's doing is it's telling Fiddler, keep an eye out if you see a request for bootstrap min.css, break on the way to the server. So I'm going to hit Control F5 and actually go back and do my page here. I'm going to hit Control F5. You'll notice Fiddler kind of glows down here. And if I go in there, you can see it's stuck waiting on that bootstrap. So the browser sent it to Fiddler, but Fiddler has held it here so that I can modify it. So again, I can just come in here, take that encoding off, just to keep our example consistent. I can go and say run to completion. Now it sent it to the server and the server came back and you can see again, it's not compressed anymore because I intercepted and made that change on the fly. I can type BPU and turn that back off again. Now I'm going to do it the other direction. So I'm going to do BP after site.css. So this time I'm saying have the browser go to the server, but when the server comes back, I want to modify what the server sends before it goes to the client. So if I re-request this again, you can see I'm sitting here waiting. So it's sent to the server. The server has the CSS. I'm going to take off the compression. Now I can make any modification I want. So I'm going to change the color to red and say run to completion. And now if I look on the client, you can see I modified that. So again, it's extremely powerful to be able to sit between a browser and a server, especially when you're working with third-party vendors, services, places that you don't even control the server-side code. You can actually make modifications and see what would happen. So it turns out another performance thing, years ago, we took all of our CSS files and bundled them into a single CSS file. So we minified them, bundled them. We cut our homepage time in half, which was awesome. It turns out that Internet Explorer had a limit that I didn't know about. So it worked great at first. We did a few more releases and we started noticing that our styles didn't work in IE, but they worked everywhere else. And so I was trying to troubleshoot, what's wrong. And it was taking a lot of time to go back into my actual web project and make changes. So I said, I'm just going to sit in between with Fiddler and I'm just going to make changes on the fly and see if I can figure out what's going wrong. So I started doing a binary search. I just started deleting half of the CSS just to see, because I wanted to see if the CSS at the very bottom didn't seem to get applied. When I took half of that CSS out on the fly, it was simple to do in here. I could just do this, right? Delete, run to completion. I noticed the styles at the bottom worked again. It turns out that you can't have more than 4,096 unique style rules in a single style sheet, which was an undocumented IE thing. So again, a practical place where the breakpoints made it really easy for me. Rather than tweak on the server, deploy, do whatever I have to do, I can just make those changes. I've also had I've worked with people that were trying to determine what was wrong with one of our CSS sheets. They weren't a developer, but I taught them how they could intercept. They were a CSS person. I taught them how to use Fiddler, how to intercept it so that they could do rapid development and fix the CSS on the fly and figure out what's wrong, and then give us the updated style sheets rather than give it to us deploy. So it's a cool thing if you need to make those kind of modifications. And that's one of the places Fiddler really stands out, just because it knows how to do those kind of modifications where other tools don't. So that is Composer. Another good one is Autoresponder. So again, because Fiddler is sitting between the client and the server, Fiddler can actually choose to send back different responses. So I can set up some rules. I'll show you what the rules look like. They're in order. I can do regular expressions if I want to. I can set particular code. So it's easier to show you this than explain it. So let me pull up the page again. I'll do Control F5. I forgot to turn my breakpoint off. So I'm going to do PP after. And I'm just going to run that to completion. Okay, so now what I want to see is I want to see what would happen. Sometimes people pull CSS files from CDNs or other sites. I want to see what would happen if my Bootstrap was slow. So there's a feature called Autoresponder. If I drag this Bootstrap over, now I can tell it, if you ever see the exact match for bootstrap min.css, do something special. So in this case, I'm going to say, please just do a delay. So I can actually artificially delay the response for just the CSS to be 15 seconds. So those are milliseconds. So if I go run this again and hit Control F5, I'm doing a performance test to see what would happen if the CSS did not get sent as fast. And this is what my customer sees, right? A completely blank screen. So this goes back to, I might want to inline just enough maybe background color, or maybe just enough of this header with the background color. If I were to embed that directly into the HTML, then if my CSS happened to be slow, I would be able to tolerate that a lot better than having a completely blank screen. And again, that's really hard to simulate. You can go into DevTools and say, act like I'm 2G, super slow, but that does every file. I can individually target specific files by using Autoresponder. So if I take that off, another cool thing I can do, I will just right click. There's multiple ways to do this. I'm going to show you the easiest. I'm going to unlock the HTML request, unlock it for editing. And if I go into the inspector, I can actually change the HTML. So I'm just going to add a dash hello, okay? And I'm going to say lock again. I'm going to drag that now over to Autoresponder, and it's going to make a rule for me. So if I go run this, if all's right, you can see now it says Sydney-hello. So if you think about what I did there now, I've avoided talking to the server completely. So the client thinks it went all the way to the web server to get something, and it actually served it off my own machine. So I've heard of people, and you can do this, you can save off your entire set of web requests locally on your own machine. if you had a super important demo that has to work, you could leave Fiddler off. But if you start to run stuff and stuff's dying, you can actually just kind of secretly open up Fiddler. If you have the Autoresponder rules set up properly, you can serve all of the stuff for that page locally off of disk, even though the server's completely dead right now. So again, a ton of power. I can do all sorts of things in here. The other thing I like to do, I like to do single point of failure analysis. So we use third parties, analytics, and things like that on our website. I care to know if my analytics partner happened to be slow or down, would that affect my primary web experience? So I can actually come in here and say, you know, maybe this bootstrap, what would happen if this thing returned a 404 or a 500 or whatever I want? So not only can I make it slow and not only can I change the content, but I can force it to fail. So I've done this with our e-commerce site to make sure that if I add a brand new partner, there's different ways to include JavaScript, doing async, defer, all that kind of stuff. I can test afterwards before I move into production. I can say, I want to simulate this vendor failing and see, will it break my site? So that's something, again, that's really powerful with Fiddler because I can individually target those requests. Okay, so I'll do a quick pause if there's any questions so far before I keep going. And the unmatched request just says if I don't have a rule for it, just send it to the server. So all of the other things, all the JPEGs and stuff I don't want to mess with, just let them go on to the server. That's what this thing does.
I love the being able to block or simulate errors with the vendors. We've had that definitely happens.
Oh, it definitely does. Yeah, and being
You
able
have no
to,
idea what that's going to do. This is
no.
fantastic, testing it ahead of time.
And vendors, they always say, put my JavaScript in the head at the very top because I have to be the first request. Well, if you're slow or you don't work, you might trash my entire experience. So it's instructive even in conversations with them to show them, okay, this is what happened. You're saying that's fine. I'm going to cause your thing to be slow. And look, now I don't paint right. So that's not true. I can't put you there. That's a risk. So yeah, that's a cool thing that's hard to do otherwise. So next one I'll talk about is tracing devices. So Fiddler Classic always ran only on Windows. So our e-commerce site is a responsive design. So we work for phone, tablets, any kind of desktop, basically any kind of web client. And so if I was testing with a phone, so as soon as we started doing responsive, we'd have a phone in our hands, we'd start to do something, and something wouldn't work and had no way to figure out why. And Fiddler's not going to run on my iPhone, but you can actually set up Fiddler so that you can trace remote devices. So I'm going to show you parts of how to do that. So let's go look at this. So the first thing I need to do, I go into Tools, Options, Connections. I say I want to allow remote computers to connect. Usually this is off. I'm going to turn that on. So now I'm saying not only am I listening with Fiddler on this port, but I'm allowing external machines to use that port and come through Fiddler as well. So I'm going to turn that on. You may end up with firewall issues. I won't get into all the firewall on your particular configuration. So you may have to enable that port in your firewall as well. But then what I need to do is I can go into the device. So I have an iPhone example here. It's not where I expected. So the iPhone proxy setting is actually in your Wi-Fi settings. So if you go into your Wi-Fi and you scroll to the bottom, you'll see this proxy setting. I'm going to manually set my proxy. So I'm running my laptop with Windows, with Fiddler. I just went to a command prompt, ran ipconfig and figured out here's the IP address of my laptop. And this is the port that Fiddler's running on. I can go on the device now and say I want to set, the same thing that you saw the browser do. Any HTTP or HTTPS traffic, I want to route to this IP and that port. So once I set that up, I went on the phone And I happen to go to that IP because the laptop happens to be the web server. It doesn't have to be. But Safari on my iPhone, because the Wi-Fi setting, it routed this traffic through my laptop. So now I'm sitting over on my Windows machine with Fiddler running, and I get this trace. So if I look at what the trace looks like, I'm just going to show you the request. You can see iPhone here, right? So I've got all the power with Fiddler, all the composer, everything else I needed, but I'm able to do it for a remote device client like iOS, Androids, any device that I can set a proxy for. I can force that traffic to route through my Windows machine. Okay. So again, that's very powerful just because, you know, I'm going to have problems on phones and tablets just like I do on desktop. Being able to troubleshoot them and route them through Fiddler and use all the techniques I'm used to is very powerful. I mentioned the reverse proxy. The idea with that is if it used to be true that some Android devices, it was hard to find the proxy settings on the client. So you can actually do, I'm not going to go through it all here, but if you look in the Fiddler documentation about reverse proxies, you can basically set up Fiddler to listen on an IP address, then just go on the device to that IP address and it'll actually route the traffic for you correctly. So if you can't set a proxy, it's a lot more involved, but just be aware, look up reverse proxy, and there's ways to do that for devices that you can't set a proxy for. Talk about some common issues. So a couple things. I can actually drag, you saw it with filters before, I can actually take this any process. I can drag this to a particular browser instance and drop it, and then it will only capture traffic from that specific Edge browser. I've had some problems with it recently where it's not quite isolating like I want it to, but that's another way to filter down to just one browser on my machine so I don't see a bunch of traces for things I don't want to see. The problem is people do that and then they close that browser instance and they forget they did that. And then they open up a browser again and that browser is not going to get traced. So they would send in and contact Eric and say, you know, Fiddler just stopped working. I don't get traces anymore. And it's because they need to come here and click that again and set it back to any process. The one I go ahead.
Does that only work with like certain browsers, or does it work with applications that use internet?
Well, so I've found it works better here doing it as a filter, and you can go down to a particular process. This used to work pretty well with any browser because all it's really doing is telling Fiddler, look for that specific process. For whatever reason, I don't know what's changed in the last few years where that just doesn't work as well as I would like. So I've tried to drag it over to a particular version of, you know, a certain Edge browser, and then suddenly it wouldn't trace at all. So it's just a little flakier. So I would tend to do it from over here, or I'll show you some other ways we can do it with Fiddler Script and stuff as well. But it's kind of nice just to be able to filter this stuff out. What I tend to do more often is I do this. As soon as I get a good trace, I'll stop capturing. So down here, I'll click this because I don't, you know, I've already got what I wanted traced. I don't want a bunch of other stuff in here that just pollutes what I'm looking at. I'll often do that, shut off the capture, and then forget that I shut it off, right? And then I come back and do, oh, I want to see this again, and I hit Control F5, and there's nothing new, and I keep wondering, well, why is that? So if you do that, which I do this a lot, just be aware you're kind of causing your own pain on both of these too. So if you use those techniques, just make sure that you know that you may have to shut those back off, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
The other thing you'll see is not having a proxy set. So we talked about when I'm doing a browser, as soon as I open Fiddler, Fiddler will tell Windows, hey, I'm listening on this port 8888. Modern browsers pick that up and they route traffic. So it's very rare now that I'll open a new browser and not be able to see it in Fiddler. But I do run ASP.NET. And in my scenario, I run IIS locally on my development machine. So I'm running the web server on my client. So the browser talks to my ASP.NET site running on my machine, and Fiddler can trace that just fine, right? That's from a browser to the web server. Fiddler already did the hook in the browser. I see that traffic. My ASP.NET stuff often calls third-party REST APIs. Those are not just automatically caught. So a lot of people will be calling other services from ASP.NET or server-side code or whatever, non-browser based. Like now my web server ASP.NET code is calling something that doesn't use the proxy settings in Windows. So I just wanted to warn you, if you do that scenario, let's say I had a server-side call here that went out and saw, current best stuff in Stockholm or whatever. I would see the browser request for everything I normally see, but that REST API call wouldn't be there. So if you're using .NET, you can actually put this in your config file. And what you're telling it is, I want to proxy all of the .NET classes that do HTTP through that IP and that port. So again, it's if you're using a tool that does HTTP or HTTPS and you don't see it automatically in Fiddler, you need to figure out how to set the proxy in that particular client to make sure it routes traffic. Because again, Wireshark, you can just start it up and say, I want to use my Wi-Fi. Anything that goes through that Wi-Fi adapter is going to get picked up by Wireshark. And again, because Fiddler is a proxy, you have to specifically route traffic to it or it won't trace it. So that's the other thing people have, is they just have a client that doesn't automatically pick up the proxy. So you just have to be aware that you have to figure out how to set it yourself.
Yeah, I know we've had some trouble with, like command line tooling and Git and,
Yep.
all kinds of CLI stuff. You have to explicitly go set for each kind of utility separate proxy settings.
Yep. And so that's the other thing I see most people say, is they say it works fine for my browser, but it doesn't work for this particular client, or like you said, command line or something else that you want to see that traffic for. So you just have to figure out how to set the proxy for it. Okay. Next thing I'll talk about is Fiddler Script. So Fiddler Script, I think it's kind of funny. It's a JavaScript language, but when Eric worked at Microsoft, .NET was hot, so they, it's JScript.NET. It's very much a JavaScript thing, but it does let you call some .NET objects. So I can write script to intercept traffic and modify it. So why would I want to do that? I'll show you a couple examples of some easy scripts. I'm going to go into rules, customize rules. And this, you can download this Fiddler script editor. So it's just got color coding. I'm going to do Control F and look for my initials because I know where that is. So there's a bunch of events in here. And the first one is this on before request. So when the browser sends, when Fiddler gets it, before it sends it to the server, it fires this event. So I can come in here and say, if I see that the session URL contains .jpeg, I want to do something, right? Maybe I want to hide it. In this case, I'm just going to show it as yellow. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go hit Control F5. And now in Fiddler, you'll see. So that's for instance, I'm just tweaking how things look. Maybe I want to hide JPEGs, or I want to hide a certain host. Things that maybe aren't simple to do here. I can basically write JavaScript-ish code to do that kind of stuff. So this would be another example where I wanted to test all of the domains besides my primary domain. If any of my third-party stuff I use dies, I could have used Autoresponder, but I use a lot of vendors. And so I didn't want to drag every vendor over and drop them in Autoresponder. So I wrote code that just said, if the host, you can see some of it down here, if the host name is, so I did a not, and I said, if this is not my domain, make it slow or make it die. And again, I could say my core server's running, everybody else is not. And I want to see what that does to my website. So I got a really good feel quickly about, again, which vendors am I not using correctly, that it could expose my customers to having impact because they're slow or down. So it's a good single point of failure sort of analysis in a very fast way, if that makes sense. So that's a practical thing that I've used that for. So again, there's one before it goes to the server before the request. There's one before the response gets sent to the client. There's also this exec action. So I'm going to do another Control F here and just get down to that one. So in this case, I wanted to create my own this quick exec down here. I'll show you some more stuff about it later, but I wanted to, there's a lot of extensibility points in Fiddler. I wanted the ability to delete certain hosts. Okay, so if I wanted to come in here, I'll make a request out to example.com. So you can see example.com. If I wanted to write something, so I called it RH for remove host, www.example.com. If you hit enter, you can see that I made it disappear. So I just wanted to extend, if you like command line stuff, you can basically write your own commands. And so I wrote one that if you type RH and you give it a host name, here's the Fiddler work, you know, some of the objects you need to use to take it out of the session list. So just kind of cool ways that you can extend Fiddler. Again, Fiddler Script is pretty powerful. Let me close that. So programmatically, you know, if you want to think big picture, programmatically, I can intercept and modify any traffic between my clients and my servers again. You know, adjust the CSS in a way that could be automated and repeated, which is kind of handy. Next thing is there's a lot of Fiddler extensions. And so if you go out to this link, and these are Fiddler Classic things, I will talk about Fiddler Everywhere in a bit, but the three, well, I'm going to focus on these two, JavaScript formatter and image bloat. And by the way, you can write your own if you want to. So I use Minified Javascript all the time. So in development even, all my stuff is minified. So if you've seen minified files before, let me pull up my page again, Control F5. I've got this JavaScript. If I look at the inspector, take off the compression, you know, you've probably seen this, right? This is what you want to do in production. You want to make your files as small as possible by taking out the comments and the white space. So it's a good technique. However, it makes my troubleshooting harder. I can go into client DevTools. I'm able to go into my sources. I can do pretty print if I wanted to, individually on files. What that does is it I don't know if unminify is a word, but that's what it does, right? It takes you back to having spaces and stuff. It doesn't, part of the minification, it shortens function names and stuff. These tools don't fix that, but they can take and put the spacing back. So I can do that individually in DevTools. If I download this extension and I turn it on and I make this request again, Fiddler will intercept, and you can see it highlighted the two that it did. Both of these two were minified. If I look at them now, because Fiddler's sitting in between, it took all that white space out. So again, it didn't fix up all the names. You should use source maps and stuff for that. But now if I go on the client browser in the DevTools, this stuff won't be all on one line. So it's a lot easier to step through looking like this than when it's all minified. So that is one of the extensions. The other one I want to show you is called image bloat. So I'm going to turn that one back off. So if you notice something here, you see these little bricks? It's telling me 43% of this image is actually metadata. So if you're familiar, we'll go pull up the actual site here. I've got Stockholm. When you take pictures with your cameras and your phones and everything, it dumps in all this metadata. Like I took this phone, so I was in Australia. I took it on quite a while ago, iPhone 6. All the shutter speed, all that stuff. Well, that's, you know, terribly interesting if I want to go see what shutter speed was, but my customers don't care, right? This metadata doesn't impact the visual. But that metadata being in those images, you can see 42% of that image size was due to metadata. I can strip that out without losing any quality. So basically, I'm nearly cutting my image in half. I use a tool called JPEG Tran. It's a command line tool. There's lots of tools that will do it, that will take that metadata out, but image bloat lets you turn that on and just quickly go through your site and see if any of your images have metadata in them and how much. So it's worth turning on and seeing. You might have a really easy performance win by stripping out that metadata that you just didn't even know was there. Okay. And then it shows me which ones it has that have metadata in here. So
I never understood what all that information is. I mean, the text you showed, maybe a few hundred bytes, but there's kilobytes of data often in these images, and I never understand. Like, I think there's like XIF, and like there's
other stuff. This is the most obvious to see.
Yeah.
But there's definitely other stuff. So
kilobytes of data in every image you take.
Yes.
It's just kind of crazy.
Well, and
I can export out of GIMP if anybody uses that. When you're exporting it gives you an option to uncheck all of this stuff, and file size becomes tiny.
And you should. And this is just a quick way to verify that you did it. So if you've ever heard the drug lord story in wherever he was, never gave interviews, decided he'd do an interview for a journalist, had jungle weeds and stuff behind him so that he thought if they took his picture, there'd be no way to identify where he was. Well, the camera had its lat long on, which is also part of the metadata.
Oh.
If you do location. So they posted that picture and didn't strip that, whoever the journalist was, and they took the lat long and, hey, now we know where you live. So another good reason to get rid of metadata. So again, you can write your own if you want to write your own extensions. There's quite a few out there that just augment what Fiddler can do. And again, that's currently a Fiddler Classic thing, but I use both of those substantially, especially the image bloat. Next one is Fiddler Cap. So Fiddler Cap, I had a senior VP in marketing, right, a business person that just had a knack for finding problems. She was our product owner. She would always find stuff wrong with our site, and she was remote from me. So we would have a problem, and it was hard for us to communicate and troubleshoot. So there's actually a tool called Fiddler Cap. So I don't want to install Fiddler on her machine, right? Fiddler's easy. It's not like senior VP easy, right? Non-technical people are not going to understand all the things you need to do in Fiddler. But I gave her Fiddler Cap, and I can tell her, set it up for decryption. Please clear your cookies, clear your cache. They're all very straightforward things. Hit start capture, it would open the browser. She could do whatever she wanted to do, cause the error to happen. She could hit this snapshot. I know this never happens to you. People will report to me, hey, your web page didn't work. And you're like, what didn't work? Well, it just didn't look right. Okay, not really that helpful. Doing a snapshot, it will actually embed what the screen actually looked like into the trace. So when I get the trace sent to me, so the idea is they do the start capture, they do whatever I ask them to do, they do snapshots if they want to, they stop the capture, they save it. That will save an archive file that they can just email to me. I can open that up in Fiddler proper and do everything I would normally do. So I can see what was the request, what was the response, and I can see the snapshots. So it made it very much easier for me to be able to troubleshoot what was going on, if that makes sense. So that's a cool tool to be able to use. I will warn you, I don't like to install stuff on other people's machines, right? I guarantee even with Fiddler Cap, about 3 months from now, someone's printer is going to break and somehow it's my fault, right? So I tend to tell them instead, change your proxy settings manually. Like I'll teach them how to go in and change their proxy settings in their browser to route it to my laptop, just as if I was tracing an iPhone. That way there's no install on their client, if that makes sense. So either technique, both of them work.
Does that require admin privileges to install?
No, to install Fiddler Cap?
Yeah.
I don't think so. And I don't think you need admin to change your proxy settings either in most browsers. Some browser, if they manage the browser, some of them will lock your ability to change that because they might have a corporate proxy server they don't want you to get rid of. So, by the way, I was saying in particular, I'm on my home laptop, so I don't have a proxy. A lot of companies have a proxy server. Fiddler's smart enough to know when it starts up if there's already a proxy anyways, it will chain it correctly, just so you know. So it's possible in a business, they might lock some of this stuff down, but in general, on a machine, you should be able to install Fiddler Cap, or at least be able to change your proxy settings. Again, depending on lockdowns, but.
Sure.
Okay. Some miscellaneous things. We talked about saving off response files. I showed you that earlier. I'll show you the screenshot. So not only does Fiddler Cap have that feature, but I'm going to do Control F5 here. Fiddler has a little camera up here, if you've ever seen that. If you click that, you've got 5 seconds to go pull up whatever you want. And I'm hearing it did a countdown and then a simulated camera noise for me there. And then if I look, I can see that it actually should embed right here. Here's the screenshot. So now again, when I'm sending it to other developers, or I just want to keep track for myself of what did the screen look like after this request was made, it's kind of cool to be able to do that screenshot there.
Oh, that's really cool.
That's
Yeah.
configurable, I hope, right? The 5 seconds, or is that?
I don't know. I'll show you where this is. There's an about. So there's a lot of things you can set under tools options. There's also, if you come down here and do about config, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you can change.
Oh, look at that. Wow.
I'm not sure if that's one of the configurable ones, to be honest with you, or not. You can skip the countdown, but that would just be a screenshot of Fiddler.
Oh, yeah, no. I was more extending it because I always lose my.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. If there is something, it would probably be in here. I haven't noticed it in the normal tools options.
Okay.
You can encrypt. So if I do a save, so if I wanted to save off all of this stuff, I just say save all sessions. By default, it's just an SAZ. I can change this to say password protected. So I'm just going to put A. And what it does is it says, give me a password. So I type in, whatever I want. Something better than that. I hit OK. It's actually going to see right here, it's using 128-bit AES encryption. So it does password key derivation based on my password. It comes up with a real AES key. So it's using serious encryption. I mean, AES is serious encryption. You can come in here and change it from 128-bit to 256, somewhere in these settings. But you can actually encrypt the capture because there are sometimes sensitive things in here, right? Especially if you're decrypting HTTPS, you might have your credentials, you might have credit cards, especially if you're sending this outside of your own company, you would want to do encryption with that. So obviously when you do, please don't send the email with the encrypted archive and then also say, oh, by the way, the password was hello world, right? Don't put them in the same email, obviously. But the encryption is serious. I mean, it's AES encryption. It's not some minor encryption he wrote himself. So another one is the text wizard. So if you've seen this here, there's a lot of times where we need to convert things between base 64. We might want to compute hashes. I did a capture the flag competition not long ago, and it had an MD5 hash. So you can do some simple things in here to do conversions. So you don't have to go to external tools to say, what would that look like as base 64 or URL decoded? All that kind of stuff is built right into this text wizard, which is kind of handy. The sandbox is just a place that you can do testing. So that's where I actually got, if I go back here, this composer, this tablet thing here, you can get to it from going to the tools sandbox. It's just a site he hosts that you can mess with without getting in trouble. You can change the price and you're not violating anything. You can create custom inspectors. So we talked about writing extensions. You can also do the custom inspectors. So there's times where one of the traditional things years ago, people did binary WCF calls. And by default, Fiddler, when you went to do an inspector for it, didn't have a nice view of what that would look like. So somebody in the community actually wrote a custom inspector. So they knew what that format actually looked like, and they wrote what it took to display it in a more friendly manner, if that makes sense. So just be aware if you have a certain file type that's specific to you, you can actually extend Fiddler and write your own inspector for that. Fiddler core is kind of cool. So years ago, they pulled out the tracing part of Fiddler and put it into Fiddler core so that you could use it in your .NET apps. So think of it as it's a headless version of Fiddler. So if you have a .NET app that you want to, maybe it's a testing app that runs a whole bunch of tests, you can actually use Fiddler core and ship it with your executable and have it do Fiddler sorts of things, which is kind of cool. So it was free. I think that is now a charged for thing. But if you need to embed sophisticated tracing and stuff into .NET, you can look into Fiddler core. You can spoof user agents. So if for some reason, I don't think anybody wants to look like Netscape 3 anymore, but I could say that I'm IE11 or horribly IE6, or I can create a custom. So basically, if I do that, Fiddler will intercept the request from Edge and change it to look like a different user agent. So if you do server side where you're tailoring output for one sort of browser versus another, or device sniffing or any of that kind of stuff, and you want to be able to set the user agent so that you're spoofing your somebody else, you can do that through here. The quick exec we talked about. So again, down here, I can run a bunch of commands. If I do greater than 50,000, it's going to highlight all the requests that were over 50,000 bytes. If I do the same thing for less than 1,000. So it's just, if you like command line things, the quick action is a cool place. I can do equals, well, this will be boring because it's all 200s, oops. You can do status codes. So in this case, I'm doing 200s. If I had any 404s or 500s, I could quickly find them just by doing equal and the status code. I can select CSS. So it selects all the CSS files. I can type CLS to clear the screen. You saw that I extended that by creating my own RH. So if you have things you want to do and you like command line stuff, you can extend that to do the sorts of things you'd want to do. You can customize the columns. So if you want to show other things, just be aware I can come in here and hide certain columns or show certain things. If I want to see the request type, getter, post, or so if something is not here as a column, just be aware that you can potentially add it. Another cool thing is host remapping. So I'm going to go to example.com. So if you haven't been out here, that's what that site looks like. I'm going to come in and change and say that I want all the requests for example.com to actually go to my local host port 86. So if I do that, it still thinks it's example.com, but this is the site that we've been using all night. So why would I want to do that? I'm doing development on my own machine, and I was using third-party libraries that were coded that they cared what my production domain name was. Like they cared that it was www.example.com, and on my machine it was my host name. So the libraries didn't work. So when I tried to troubleshoot on my own machine, these third-party libraries were not executing correctly. So by doing this in Fiddler, I was tricking the browser client and those third-party libraries to think they were www.example.com, even though they were actually running by pointing at my own development machine instance, so I could do Visual Studio debugging and everything else that I wanted to do. So that's kind of a nice feature if you need to do things like that. Turn that back off. So I want to talk quickly about Fiddler Everywhere. So right now it's on version 1.5. Again, the advantage of Fiddler Everywhere is it's multi-platform. So it's going to run Windows, Linux, or Mac. It's got an improved user interface. So I've used Fiddler forever, so I'm just used to where these things are. But people who are new to Fiddler can find that kind of overwhelming with all of the buttons, you know, all of this going on, right? All these tabs. So the idea with Fiddler Everywhere is they wanted to improve and do a more modern user interface. They also wanted to focus on collaboration. So you saw I saved an archive file that I could email to people. They wanted to have it easier within the tool to do like cloud-based sharing. So I could share with team members, store it in the cloud if I wanted to, communicate to people, send links to it. So it's just more collaboration. So those are all the good things. I'll show you some of the things we can do in there. Because they're moving features into this is relatively new. They're still pulling all these features. So the things that I showed you tonight, extensions, Fiddler Script, breakpoints, quick exec, some of the statistics and stuff are not yet in version 1.5. But if you want cross-platform and you're not using a lot of those features, it's a good choice. So I'm going to pull it up here. So this is also going to kick off. I got my new Fiddler shirt on. Runs on a different port, 8866 instead of 8888. So it's done the same thing though. I started it. It told Windows, hey, I'm running on 8866. Please route your browser traffic. So if I go back and do a Control F5, I go back to you'll see this looks pretty familiar. Here's our list of sessions. So I can look, here's my HTML request. I can see all the headers. I can see the raw view if I like that. Same thing with the body. I can see the raw version of the response that is encoded here. So I can do some decoding, and sometimes I have to move away from that. I can do word wrapping. So a much more streamlined interface. Again, all of the kind of functions I'm used to, if I were to right click, you'll see the things we saw earlier for marking and commenting and saving and things like that. I can add a rule to do an autoresponder. So you can see I took Bootstrap, brought it over here. I just had right clicked and said add a rule. It put it automatically into autoresponder. I'm going to turn autoresponder on. And I can come here and change this again to be that I want to have that be a delay. So again, I can do 15 seconds. And then if I go back and do that again, see what you saw before, it's making that individual file. So you can see that autoresponder is still there. I can also right click and do the composer. So I can just say edit in composer. And here I have either a raw view or I've got a little easier view here where I can just say take off the accept encoding and please execute that again. And then if I go back to the list, I'll be able to see, oh, it's got still waiting. You can see the dash here because I left my autoresponder rule on. But when it comes back, we'll see that that's not going to be compressed. As you can see, it's 122K. So it's not compressed anymore. So the main features that probably 90% of Fiddler users use, the tracing, the autoresponder, the composer, some of the additions that are kind of cool. I can save off sessions. So I did a previous in the past, if you did a Fiddler trace 3 days ago and then you did one now, it was kind of tricky to have two of them open. I can actually save off a session. So now I can just open it here and it's just another tab. So now I can bounce back and forth between this is what I just recorded versus what I had a week ago. So I can save those off. I don't know if you can see, I've got a 1 here. I clicked this share and I sent this to someone else. So I sent an email and shared with somebody else that session. So as long as they have Fiddler Everywhere, they can go pull that and view that in there. So it's just some better collaboration. And then I can also save off individual requests. So I can open up, save a request, and it'll pop it back over here in Composer so that I can just re-execute things that I want to store. So if I have a series of things I want to be able to run all the time, I can just store them over here on the left and come and say I want to re-execute those. It's a little more obvious how to turn capturing off. You saw I was clicking in the bottom left corner in Classic. So just some user interface improvements. Again, the collaboration and a lot of the stuff is here and it's cross-platform. and they're just making it better with each release. So the goal is to eventually have all of these features move over so that you can take advantage of it in Fiddler Everywhere. Some quick research. Go ahead.
Does it do the automatic proxy insertion?
Yes. Yep.
And, nice.
Yep. Yeah, so when I started that up, if I were to go into Edge, it should say 8866 for the proxy. So it's telling Windows just like the other version did. And so again, any client that understands that, so you can see the 8866 there, it's just running on a different port. So you still have the client limitations. If clients don't know how to read Windows settings to get the proxy, you're still stuck. But as long as they do, they both automatically set it up so that people can hook into that like that.
Right.
Hey, Robert.
So, yeah.
Way to exchange files between Fiddler Anywhere and Fiddler Classic?
That is a good question. I have not tried to do that. I have not tried to see what the actual, it's like if I save these off, I know I can put local storage and I can choose a folder. I have not tried to capture an archive here and see if it turns out to be an SAZ file that I can actually import into Fiddler. I'm going to check that out. I honestly do not know if that is possible or not. So that's an excellent question because you might have different people. The advantage of this, you know, the sell for why one of the big things for Fiddler Everywhere is the collaboration. It's certainly much easier when you're both on Fiddler Everywhere because it ties it. You can choose to put it into the cloud. It knows, you can see that I'm signed in. So you can do stuff with Teams. There's a pro version where you can share more and have more control. So it's definitely built to make that collaboration and cloud storage and stuff a lot easier. But I could see where I'm committed to everywhere. I do send this to a lot of ops people, security people. It's amazing how much more vendors understand Fiddler. So years ago, we would have an issue and I'd say, do you know how to use Fiddler? And a lot of vendors would say no. Today I can say, it's clearly your fault, right? I can send you a trace that says, I'm requesting your JavaScript file and you're returning a 500 something. It's you. Can I send you a Fiddler trace and show it? And most of the people I deal with now know how to use Fiddler. So I could see where you could end up in that situation where somebody would have everywhere. So I'll look into that. I'm not sure.
Thanks.
So I am a Pluralsight author. I have 2 specific courses on Fiddler. The first one is really you have a problem with your website. Is Fiddler or DevTools the right tool? So I say, like, you have a style problem, which one should you use? So I kind of start with, here's your problem and which one of the tools or both of them, and then shows you how to solve that problem in that particular tool. The other one is more focused just specifically on Fiddler and shows how do you write a custom inspector. It's a lot more advanced. How do you write extensions, all of that kind of stuff in addition to the stuff that we went through. It turns out Fiddler, as of today, April is free month for Fiddler or for Pluralsight. So if you're interested in seeing those and you're not a Pluralsight subscriber, you can sign up for the free April and be able to watch those. Eric wrote an excellent book.
It's not an April 1st joke, right?
No, it's not.
It's actually true. Okay.
No, it's actually true. Yes. You have to, if you do go out there though, you have to watch all 9 of mine first before the other ones unlock.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, that's a joke.
Well,
you should watch them, but that's actually a joke. Eric has actually written a really good book on Fiddler Classic, and I've probably read it, I said probably 10 times, where I'll sit down and read it, like that host remapping. I read it on, I don't know, iteration 7, and I thought, why would I ever need to do that? And I just couldn't come up with where would I need to spoof a domain like that. And 2 years later, suddenly, hey, this library doesn't work because it doesn't think we're production. And oh, I know you can do host remapping. So I keep rereading it every year or so, just because there's so much stuff in there that wasn't obvious to me, which I've tried to save you the time of all the things I've kind of found over a decade of using it. But if you really want to get into details about how it functions and stuff, that is a very good book. That's my Twitter, my email, my blog. Here's the promised link for the slides and the code. There's not a lot of code, it's just the page. But if you want to test out some of the stuff that and see it look the same way, you can get that. But like I said, all the slides are there. So we've got time, I think, if there are any specific questions people had now. Otherwise, feel free to reach out in the future.
That quick exec seems pretty cool. I like that. Learning it, I guess, there's a short list of, or maybe not so short list of commands to learn. How did you create your own, or how did you create your shortcuts?
Yeah, so the one I did myself, I'm going to go back into Classic here. If you go into this customize rules, it will actually, there's a specific file in program files. I don't remember the name of it. It's a JS file, which is what this is. And if I do my search here, so I knew this onExec action existed. So I can come in here and just, and this is where it's got documentation on the right. You can look up documentation for basically what are the objects that Fiddler has available that you can use, right?
Oh, nice.
Like
Oh,
session.
wow.
And I think it has IntelliSense, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So, I mean, for being a built-in editor like this, you've got IntelliSense. You can kind of self-discover as you go through, but the documentation within here and also on their website can give you a really good clue on how to do. And they've got the basics. You can see here all the ones that are there.
Oh, that's a great discovery tool. I thought I'd have to just go look at it on the web page or something. It's all right
so
here.
I mean, you can see it all right here, and you can make tweaks. And so I found that I was constantly, here's a bunch of third-party hosts that I just don't want to see. So I just decided to invest in doing this, and it was very handy. And yeah, especially it seems there was the whole wave of do everything visual, and now there's this whole wave of do everything command line. So everybody loves the command line again, because I started in Unix, and that's all I had, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the pendulum has swung. So if you like that, it's a cool way to be able to extend the tool to make it powerful to do the things that you want to be able to do quickly right here at the bottom instead of having to kind of find it around here. So
I mean, the fact that they have how all of their built-in scripts work right there, you can go steal, some of the parts of their existing ones and, make your own custom ones. Oh, that's tremendous. I love that.
Yeah, he built a lot of extensibility into this product. I mean, so that's where the book comes in, and the older Pluralsight course I have where it talks about those kind of how do you write the C# to write your own extension and stuff. He's got so many hooks in this thing. And here's the custom rules.js is the name of that file. They mention it now. Of course, my tooltip came up, but so you can find that on disk and save copies of it. So you could have different rules if you wanted to, and just put the right one there to have different things if you wanted to do that as well. So by the way, here's the other place that does some simple filtering. I only want web browser traffic versus any process on my machine that might be talking HTTP. So I typically just say web browser right away, just so I don't have background service traffic in here too. That's another thing I had forgot to mention. So I don't know if there are other things people want to see.
Very cool. I especially like the one with the redirect from like a URL to IP and a specific port. So back to your localhost .88 or 86 or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, being able to route that is cool. Yeah, I used to do, Pluralsight used to have their top 100 courses. So that was one of my demos for Composer. I would actually take their page and save it off and then make my courses be like number 1, 2, 7, give somebody 3 and 4 just so it didn't look completely obvious. But then you sit on the machine, you can actually, use Fiddler for good, not for evil, but I'll show you, you can actually make Fiddler not be present. You can hide it when it's minimized.
Oh.
So people don't know it's running. And then you can play tricks on them because you're intercepting and modifying things and they think they're seeing something on site XYZ and you've actually spoofed and shown them. You're like, look, I'm in the top 100. And
I
so
should have known this. I should have known this last week. I would have installed Fiddler on a couple of machines at work.
there you go.
For April 1st.
Yes.
Not for malicious purposes.
You said, I don't know if there's anything else, but if not, feel free to reach out to me. You can follow me on Twitter and see what other talks I've got going on. I've been doing a lot virtual in the last year, not surprisingly, on HTTPS and web performance and Fiddler and Pi-hole, if you've heard of Pi-hole and other things like that. So if you have any interest in that, and email me if you have questions. So
Excellent. Thank you very much, Robert. Really
You're welcome.
appreciate you coming here and enlightening us with your knowledge. And hopefully we'll use Fiddler more. I've always used Fiddler, but I had no idea with some of the stuff you showed. I'm gonna dive deeper. That quick exec, I'm definitely going to take a look at the things you can do. So that's really impressive. I also didn't really realize you could save off and send your captures to somebody else, including screenshots. I mean, my way of sending traces is screenshot the trace and send the one image.
right.
Like the right way of doing it.
Well, it's so handy, especially usually you've got a series of requests you have to make. When you take that screenshot, it's got it in the right position inside the archives. I can see the screen was here for that request rather than, okay, you attach 4 screenshots. I'm not quite sure. It'll be right in place where you need it to be, which is
I
handy.
love that. Yeah, that screenshot feature is amazing. Very nice.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Thank you again. Next month, guys, in our main talk, we're going to have an introduction to the actor model with Okta.net. So that's going to be something we're looking forward to. Create powerful and concurrent and distributed applications more easily. So come check that out. First Thursday of next month. That's going to be May 6th. All right, guys, that's it. Thank you very much.
All
Thanks,
right,
guys.
see you.
See you next
Bye,
week.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See ya. Yep.